Thank you so much. There we go. I think we're good. Okay, as mentioned, my presentation today is called Getting It Right, Plant-Based Nutrition from Birth Through the Senior Years. So it's a lot to cover, and certainly we won't be covering every single aspect, but I'm going to give you, I hope, a pretty good overview. So we'll be talking first about the safety and adequacy of plant-based diets. And when I say plant-based, we'll be looking mostly at vegan and vegetarian diets specifically. And then we'll talk about some of the nutrients of interest, the nutrients that people are asking questions about a lot. So we'll look at protein, iron, zinc, calcium, and vitamin D, B12, omega-3 fatty acids, and iodine. And then we'll conclude with a very short sort of segment called What to Eat that is a real practical piece, and we'll finish up with that. So first, let's take a look at the safety and adequacy of plant-based diets. I want to begin by telling you in the 1970s, when I went to university, this was before I was actually vegan, I learned a couple of things about plant-based or especially vegan and vegetarian nutrition. One of my professors was Zach Sabry, who wrote a book called Nutri-Score, and that was the text for one of our programs. And in this book, it says adults and only adults can safely remove meat, but nothing more from their diets. And an interpretation is adults can be lacto-ovo-vegetarian. They can't be vegan. And people other than athletes, like children and teens, can't even be vegetarian. It's not safe. So that's what we learned in university. And then our introductory nutrition textbook, prior to 1975, vegetarians were included in a chapter called Food Faddism and Quackery. And then after 1975, they actually changed the title to Alternative Food Patterns. So upped it on the spectrum of acceptance a little bit. But you can imagine, so this, we're talking, what, 40 years ago, it was, basically all I can say is we've come a long way, thank goodness. The number one evidence-based resource globally has actually been this piece from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics on, it's actually their position statement on nutrition, on vegetarian diets. And they state in this position that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Well-planned vegetarian diets are appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and for athletes. And this is the sad news. The position statement recently expired, and I actually checked into this, and it doesn't look like we will have a replacement for this type of position paper. And the reason is that the Academy is shifting to a more targeted position papers that use an evidence analysis process. And so they're taking targeted questions. Right now, they're assembling an expert panel for a systematic review on vegetarian dietary patterns and health outcomes. So it won't be the comprehensive reviews that the old positions were, which to me is disappointing. But nonetheless, we will probably have a number of different reviews or position statements that do look at various aspects of vegetarian and plant-based diets. In the meantime, the 2016 paper is actually a really good resource. It's a reliable summary of the literature, and it is still used and respected around the world. There is another expert review, and the lead author on this was actually one of the authors on the 2016 position paper, Winston Craig. And so this paper is actually also very useful. It's called The Safe and Effective Use of Plant-Based Diets with Guidelines for Health Professionals. So that's one you can certainly provide to health professionals if you need this kind of document. So how do plant-based diets fare in terms of nutrient content and diet quality? So what I want to do, because there's so much information here, is just give you a brief glimpse of the last decade of research. So we'll actually look at research that compares different nutrient intakes and diet quality of people that are consuming either vegan diets, and we use a V for vegan diets, lacto-ovo-vegetarian diets, which are represented by an LOV, or non-vegetarian diets, which are NV. So here's our brief summary. And what I did was, rather than go by year, I went by the number of participants in the study. So the first study we'll talk about is one that has over 90,000 participants, was done in 2017 in France. And in this study, the lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans have the best macronutrient composition and diet quality. Vegans had the highest fiber intakes and the lowest intakes of saturated fat, sugary drinks, and refined foods. Vegans also had the highest intakes for 12 micronutrients. However, they did fall short on calcium and B12. All dietary groups were low in their intakes of vitamin D. The second is a study from RISO, that's an Adventist Health study, over 70,000 participants in this study. And in this particular Adventist Health study too, the vegans had the highest intakes of fiber, vitamin C, iron, potassium, and magnesium. There were actually no nutritional shortfalls in any of the dietary groups, except for vitamin D, which was low in all dietary groups. The next study is an Epic Oxford study from the UK, over 30,000 individuals. And in this study, the vegans again had the highest intakes of fiber, vitamin C, vitamin E, folate, magnesium, iron, and copper. Vegans had the greatest cardiometabolic benefits, but 85% of the vegans in this study were low in B12 and iodine. The next study is one from Belgium, and it was almost 1,500 participants. And in this study, the vegans scored the highest and the non-vegans scored the lowest for the healthy eating index and the Mediterranean diet score. So these are actually diet quality scores. And so this is pretty significant. Vegans had the lowest intakes of total unsaturated fat, sodium, and the highest intake of fiber. Vegans had about half the rates of overweight and about a quarter the rates of obesity compared to non-vegetarians. And then we have a study out of Denmark, over 1,300 individuals. And in this study, vegans came closer to the Nordic nutrition recommendations than non-vegetarians. Vegans met nutrient needs except for vitamin D, iodine, and selenium. Women also surprisingly had a low intake of vitamin A, which is not commonly seen. The next study was one from Germany, 258. So we're looking at a smaller number of participants, but 258 participants. Vegans have the lowest intakes of calories, total unsaturated fat, cholesterol, and sugar. Vegans have the highest intakes of fiber, vitamins A, C, E, K, folate, magnesium, and iron. However, they did fall short of recommended intakes for B12, vitamin D, calcium, and zinc. The next was a study from Switzerland, just over 200 individuals. And in this study, all dietary patterns were nutritionally sound. Vegan intakes of B12, vitamin D, calcium, and zinc were below, however, the RDA. B12 status was good, though, as vegans were using B12 supplements. And then a study out of Germany with just 72 individuals. Vegans in this study had the highest intakes of fiber, folate, and vitamins A, B1, B6, C, E, and K. There were no differences in vitamin B12, vitamin D, or iron status of the individuals in this study. However, the vegans did have reduced iodine status. And then the last study that we'll look at is one from Finland, 41 individuals, and the vegans had more favorable fatty acid profiles. They had higher fiber and phytochemical intakes. However, they did fall short on B12, vitamin D, iodine, and selenium. So in summary, well-planned vegan diets, whether they're plant-based, plant-exclusive, or omnivorous, I should say well-planned diets, whether plant-based, plant-exclusive, or omnivorous, can meet nutritional requirements. Vegans generally have the highest intakes of folate, vitamin C, K, E, iron, potassium, magnesium, and copper. The nutrients that most commonly fall short are B12, calcium, vitamin D, iodine, and zinc. So reliable sources of these nutrients need to be provided. Overall, vegans had the highest diet quality scores and the highest quality diets. The lowest intakes of total and saturated fat, the lowest intakes of sugar, fried foods, sodium, highly processed foods, and the highest intakes, I hope I said the lowest intakes of total and saturated fat, and so on. And the highest intakes of fiber, phytochemicals, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. It's, I think, important for people to recognize that just because a dietary pattern falls short of the RDA doesn't mean that's unusual. All dietary patterns will fall short of the RDA for certain nutrients. Governments have actually attempted to fill the gap by implementing nutrition education programs and fortifying food. So adding iodine to salt, adding vitamins A and D to milk, adding B vitamins and iron to grains, for example. Expanding nutrition education to include plant-based diets and fortifying plant-based staples like non-dairy milks and plant-based proteins can also help to fill the gap for plant-based eaters. These practices are actually more common in North America than Europe, which explains some of the differences between the results in North America and the results in Europe. So the next question that often comes up is, are plant-based diets safe and adequate to support the growth and development of infants and children? And we have, relatively limited findings, but about 30 years plus of findings. And the findings, if we're, to look at them, sort of as a totality of the evidence, lacto-ovo-vegetarian children grow at least as well as omnivorous children. Actually, there was a study in the Adventist health, various studies that showed the lacto-ovo-vegetarian children actually were taller and bigger than omnivorous children. So they certainly grow as well. Vegan children grow normally, although growth may be slower, especially during the toddler years. They do tend to be a little bit smaller and lighter. The most recent studies we have come out of Germany, and these are the Vecchi studies. There are 2 on toddlers and 2 on youths, and over 400 children were examined per cohort. And they included vegans, lacto-ovo-vegetarian children, and omnivores. They examined nutrient intakes, nutritional status, and growth. And there were no significant differences in energy intake or growth among the different dietary groups. All groups were well nourished, although they were below reference intakes for calcium and vitamin D, with the vegans having the lowest intakes for those nutrients. However, vegans had the highest intakes of fiber, vitamin B1, B6, vitamin C, E, K, folate, iron, potassium, and magnesium, and they had the lowest intakes of sugar and saturated fat. The author's conclusion was that vegetarian, including vegan diets, can meet recommended intakes during childhood and adolescence. There was a Polish study that got a lot of press from 2021. This study looked at 187 5 to 10-year-old children consuming either vegan, vegetarian, or omnivorous diets. The vegan diets were associated with a healthier cardiometabolic risk profile, lower fat mass, lower blood cholesterol, lower fasting glucose levels. The intakes of sugar and saturated fat were lower. The intakes of fiber were higher. But vegan diets were associated with lower intakes of calcium, vitamin D, and B12. The B12 deficiency was only in unsupplemented diets. Vegan children were, however, slightly smaller, and they had reduced bone density, although their bone density was still within the normal reference range. There was a Canadian study from 2022 with almost 9,000 children that found that those who eat vegetarian, including vegan diets, had similar measures of growth and nutrition compared to those who eat meat. Vegetarian children had higher odds, however, of being underweight. According to the lead author, a plant-based dietary program pattern is recognized as a healthy eating pattern due to increased intake of fruits, vegetables, fiber, whole grains, and reduced saturated fat. Vegetarian diets appear to be appropriate for most children. The take-home message for pediatric plant-based diets is that vegan and vegetarian diets are safe and adequate when they're appropriately planned. We need to ensure sufficient calories and micronutrients, including reliable sources of B12, calcium, and vitamin D. We want to avoid overly restrictive regimes and provide fortified foods or supplements as they're needed. We have to remember that infancy and early childhood are stages of life when adequate growth and development are the top nutritional priorities. Plant-based diets can be less energy dense. Like all diets for infants and toddlers, they need to be designed to ensure adequate calories and nutrition. The bottom line is all diets for children, regardless of dietary pattern, need to be appropriately planned to ensure nutrient needs are met. And this just, to prove a point, which lunch tray is more appropriately planned? People assume that an omnivorous diet is going to be somehow superior to a plant-based diet for children, when in fact it really is the other way around. Plant-based diets provide far more nutrient dense. Far more nutrient dense. They provide more of the essential nutrients we need generally, and they're more conducive to lifelong good health. When we think of the SAD diet, or the standard American diet, over a third of children eat fast food on any given day in the United States. Close to 70% of calories come from highly processed foods. Fewer than 1 in 10 children meet recommended intakes for fruits and vegetables. This is appalling. And so we really need to consider all of this. About 50% of American children and adolescents are either overweight or obese. The reality about vegetarian and vegan diets is they're higher quality diets. They're associated with higher intakes of fruits, vegetables, and associated nutrients. They're lower in sweet and salty snacks. They're lower in total and saturated fat, and they reduce the risk of obesity in children. And if we look at overweight and obesity among vegetarians and vegans, two of the big studies that have compared people eating a variety of dietary patterns are the Epic Oxford study and the Adventist Health study too. And if you look at the BMI, or the body mass index, that the individuals who participated in these studies have, you can see. So what I want to show you is this yellow region is what we consider to be a healthy BMI, which is essentially between 18.5 and 24.9. And what you can see is everyone in all dietary groups of these health conscious individuals in Epic Oxford were within the healthy BMI range, but the vegans were the leanest of all categories. And in the Adventist Health study too, the vegans were the only group that fell within the healthy BMI range. The lacto-ovo vegetarians, the fish eaters, and the meat eaters were all above. They were all they were all in the overweight category. Obesity is above 30. So what we need to recognize, however, is some vegetarian and vegan diets are more healthful than others. When you think about this snack that this little girl is eating, it's 100% vegan snack. It doesn't mean it's good for you. Ensuring adequacy in a diet involves providing high quality food, ensuring a sufficient quantity of food, having a wide variety of foods in the diet, and adding in fortified foods or nutritional supplements when they are indicated. So let's move on to look at some of the nutrients of interest in plant-based diets. Protein, iron, zinc, calcium and B12, calcium and vitamin D, B12, omega-3s, and iodine. I did cover protein in my last lecture, but I decided to cover it again here for those of you that are just catching this lecture. So starting with protein, I think this is my favorite protein cartoon of all times. This little rodent is asking this big muscular gorilla, no meat at all, are you sure you're getting enough protein? And the reality is anyone who's plant-based has been asked the question, where are you getting your protein? Or where do you get your protein? But the reality, of course, is even the largest mammals on the planet manage to get enough protein from plants to build huge muscles. So puny people probably can too. We're so small by comparison. There are many, many athletes and bodybuilders and healthy individuals who manage to get enough protein purely from plants. So the big question to ask is, how much protein do we actually need? Well, the RDA for protein is generally stated in terms of grams per kilogram per day. An infant needing 1.5 or so during early infancy, 1.2 during later infancy. Children need about 1, toddlers about 1.05, and older children about 0.95. Teens about 0.85, adults about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with kilograms a pound, or a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. And then for pregnancy and lactation, it's a little higher, 1.1 during pregnancy, 1.3 during lactation. So what does that mean in terms of grams per day? Well, the RDA in grams per day refers or applies only to a specific reference body weight, which you see in the red numbers on the left-hand side here. And so you have to adjust this number for individuals because everybody has a bit different body weight. But these reference body weights, for reference body weights, you would be looking at about 13 grams for a toddler, about 19 for a 4 to 8-year-old, about 34 for a 9 to 13-year-old, and then somewhere between about 46 and 56 for teens and adults, about 71 for pregnant and lactating women. You need more for athletes. And I'm not talking about, people that do, like I do, an hour of exercise a day. I'm talking about competitive athletes. So there is no separate RDA for them, but 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day are generally recommended by, health authorities and in position statements and so on, depending on the individual's training. Has been suggested that we may need more for seniors. So there's no separate RDA for seniors in North America, although protein digestibility and synthesis are reduced. Some countries actually do have a separate RDA, like Australia, for example, has a separate RDA for seniors. But consensus is building that a consumption of 1 to 1.3 grams per kilogram per day reduces age-related muscle loss. Achieving this level of intake can be challenging because energy needs are typically reduced in this population, so they eat less, but they need more protein. So it's a little bit more challenging. If you do the math, so you take an athlete or senior who needs 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, that person weighs 75 kilos or 165 pounds, they would require about 90 grams of protein per day. Well, for an athlete who consumes 3,000 calories, that would amount to about 12% of his calories from protein. That's really easy to achieve on almost any diet. For a senior eating 1,800 calories per day, that would amount to 20% of calories from protein. And that is more difficult to achieve on a plant-based diet. So what we're saying here is we probably need to focus a little bit more on ensuring that we've got a decent source of protein in each meal for seniors. We possibly may need more for people who are eating truly whole food plant-based diets. So fiber in plant cell walls reduces protein digestibility. So for those eating very high fiber, whole food, plant-based diet, some experts recommend an increase of 30% for toddlers, 20% for children 4 to 8, 15% for children 9 plus and teens, and 10% for adults. This is not necessary for people who regularly eat lower fiber foods like plant-based meat alternatives, tofu, soy milk, peanut butter, those kinds of foods, or for lacto-ovo vegetarian people who regularly include dairy and eggs in their diet. If we look at protein digestibility can be increased by reducing anti-nutritional factors such as trypsin inhibitors and lectins by soaking, sprouting, fermenting, and cooking foods. But we can reduce or increase protein digestibility by breaking down fiber, by grinding, blending, making a smoothie, other food processing techniques that reduce particle size, thereby freeing up the protein to be absorbed. And by removing or reducing fiber through refining, which of course isn't our best option from a nutritional perspective. So if you look at the actual digestibility of food, you can see that these lower fiber foods or foods that have had the particles broken down, we digest about 92 to 96% of the protein. So that's things like, white flour, bread, soy protein isolate, peanut butter, tofu, or even whole wheat flour or bread. That's not that much different from what we would absorb from animal products that have no fiber at all, like beef or milk or eggs. Of course, we do absorb a little bit less from higher fiber whole plant foods like oatmeal at 86%, lentils at 84%, and most other legumes somewhere between 72 and 89% of the protein being digested. So if we, consider these additions for whole food plant-based eaters, we would be increasing, the grams of protein per kilogram body weight. You can see in the various groups a little bit, by the amounts recommended, the 30, 20, 15, and 10%. And so we would be looking at, close to 1.4 for toddlers, a little over the 1 for children, close to 1 for teens, and close to 0.9 for adults, and about 1.2 for pregnancy, 1.4 for lactation. And what that means in terms of grams a day is we're looking at around close to the 20 grams for young children, around the 40 for older children, and around the 50 to 60 for teens and adults, and around 78 for pregnant and lactating women. So average requirements for protein are 46 grams a day for women, 56 for men. If we add 10%, it would be 50 grams for women, 62 for men. So it's still not a terribly high amount of protein. So what are actual intakes? Well, in let's see, 7 or 8 studies, 2, 4, 6, 7 studies here, you can see that average intakes in meat, and this is health conscious individuals. Most of these studies are looking at health conscious individuals, 92 grams a day on average, and for vegetarian 76, and for vegan 72. So you can see they're all, have a pretty good amount above that sort of RDA. So what about intakes in toddlers? Well, Veggie looked at that. They looked at 430 1 to 3-year-old children. Average intakes were 2.7 grams per kilogram per day for all omnivores, 2.3 for lacto-ovo, 2.4 for vegans, and the RDA is 1.05 grams per kilogram per day. So they were all well beyond double the RDA, so not much of a problem achieving needs. What about older children? Well, again, the Veggie Youth study looked at 401 6 to 18-year-olds. Their average intakes were 1.36 for omnivores, 1.14 for lacto-ovo, and 1.16 for vegans. The RDA is 0.85 to 0.95 grams per kilogram per day. So again, above the RDA. So, if you look at, and you can see why if you start to look at the protein content of selected foods. So we get about 15 to 30 grams of protein in a cup of soybeans, or 3 ounces of veggie meat, or a half a cup of tofu, or a cup of lentils or other legumes. That's about the same as what we get from 3 ounces of meat, poultry, or fish. We get some, 6 to 13 in, a quarter cup of hemp seeds, a cup of, cooked grains like spelt, wheat, or kamut, a quarter cup of pumpkin seeds, and then all of the other foods like nuts and soy milk and quinoa and so forth. This isn't much different than what you'd get from a couple of eggs or a cup of milk or an ounce of cheese. Plant-based eaters generally get enough protein unless they get insufficient calories. They have eating disorders, illnesses, or they just don't get enough food. This is not that common in North America. Most people don't have a problem getting enough calories. Second is their diets are just very poorly balanced or poorly planned. They're high-fat, high-sugar junk food diets, like, soda and French fries, tea and toast diets, and some fruitarian diets may not make the cut either, because fruits tend to be a little lower in protein. Or they fail to meet their increased needs, like seniors with low energy intakes or poor appetite, pregnant women with morning sickness, they may not get enough protein either. Many people say, but isn't plant protein inferior to animal protein? And the reality is the concern here is that plant protein is incomplete, or they're missing one or more of the 9 essential amino acids. And the truth is, all whole plant foods contain all 9 essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are essential because animals don't make them. They're made by plants. So it makes no sense to think we can't get them from plants. It's where they come from. So that's, the bottom line. Sometimes the amount of lysine, leucine, or methionine may be low in a single food per gram of protein in that food. This could be an issue if we only ate one food, but we don't. We eat a variety of foods. And I think it's really important when we're talking about, the sort of quality of protein, plant versus animals, so animal protein, to recognize that protein quality is not just about essential amino acids. It's about how well that protein sustains health throughout life. Plant protein reduces risk of mortality and disease. Animal protein increases risk of mortality and disease. And it's also about, to me, how, a protein source will support the health of the planet as well. So these are issues that, need to be considered. As I said, all essential amino acids are made by plants. So we get them directly by eating plants or indirectly by eating animals that eat. Do we need to complement proteins to ensure sufficient essential amino acids? And we've known since the 80s that we don't need to do that, but somehow it's something that people just can't seem to get over. So it's not necessary to complement protein if we eat enough protein and calories. All we need to do is eat a variety of plant foods over the course of the day and include some lysine, leucine-rich choices like legumes as part of the mix. We can boost intake of protein by including at least one protein-rich choice at each meal, like beans, lentils, split peas, tofu, tempeh, edamame, or other soy foods, veggie meats if we're so inclined, seitan, seeds, nuts. We can also include, especially for children, I think this is quite relevant, and for seniors, some lower fiber choices in the mix, like tofu, soy milk, peanut butter, seitan. And then selecting, when we select, if we're using commercial non-dairy milks, to select milks with higher protein, like soy or pea milk, for example. Moving on to iron. How much iron do we need? Well, this is the shocker. Infants, the RDA for infants 7 to 12 months of age is 11 milligrams a day. It's 8 milligrams for an adult man. Okay, so that's more iron than what an adult man needs for an infant. Children 1 to 13 years of age, it's 7 to 10, depending on age. And then for teens, it's 11 for males, 15 for females who are menstruating, of course, and then 18 for women because they lose iron each month. During pregnancy and lactation, it's 27 during pregnancy and only 9 during lactation because they're not generally menstruating. The upper limit for iron is 40 for children and 45 for teens, and adults. So this is important to know because we don't want to overdo iron either. Do vegetarians need more iron? Well, the Institute of Medicine recommends, although it's not a separate RDA, they recommend 1.8 times greater intakes for vegetarians. But this is, to me, a really controversial figure. It was based on one test diet that maximized iron absorption inhibitors and minimized iron absorption enhancers. It's not reflective of typical plant-based diets. While needs may be slightly higher, 1.8 times to me is an overestimate for most individuals eating a varied plant-based diet. So what are actual iron intakes? Well, this is a bit of a surprise to most people, but if you compare non-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans, you'll see that non-vegetarians actually have lower intakes than either lacto-ovo-vegetarians or vegans, with vegans generally having the highest intakes. What about in toddlers and youth? Same story. Non-vegetarians around the 6 milligrams a day, lacto-ovo around the 7, and vegans around the 9. So a little bit higher intakes in vegans. However, there are two forms of iron in food. Heme iron, which is found mainly in meat, poultry, and fish. 40 to 70% of the iron in meat is heme iron. It's about 15 to 35% bioavailable. And intake is associated, however, with metabolic syndrome, heart disease, colorectal cancer, and it's a bit of a pro-oxidant in the body. So it's, it's definitely more bioavailable, but that doesn't make it necessarily a good thing. Non-heme iron, by contrast, is found in both plants and meat. It's only 1 to 23% bioavailable, but that depends on physiological iron requirements. So absorption in iron deficient individuals can actually be 10 times higher than it is in iron replete individuals. Vegetarians who generally don't have a higher risk for iron deficiency, except possibly in menstruating women. However, we do have lower serum ferritin or iron stores. Lower iron stores that are within the normal range don't affect how a person feels or, and do not appear to be a disadvantage when the diet's replenishing iron losses and hemoglobin and hematocrit are normal. It actually may turn out to be an advantage as higher serum ferritin tends to be associated with increased risk of some chronic diseases. However, iron deficiency is the most common nutritional deficiency in infancy and childhood, with the greatest risk being in preschoolers. And if a preschooler has low iron over time, it can impact cognitive and motor function, which can persist beyond childhood, and it can also impair their immune function. So what are the factors that would increase risk of iron deficiency in infants and children? Well, in infants, premature birth or low birth weight is a big red flag for increased risk of iron deficiency. Early introduction to cow's milk dramatically increases risk. Use of unfortified infant formula, late introduction to solid foods more than 6 months of age. And in children and teens, drinking too much cow's milk over 24 ounces a day in those ages 1 to 5 years. Insufficient dietary sources, lead exposure, health conditions, chronic infections, or heavy menstrual bleeding. And if we look at recommendations for or iron for infants, the addition of iron-rich and iron-enriched foods should begin by 6 months of age. Providing 11 milligrams of iron for a 7 to 12-month-old infant is challenging without iron-fortified foods or supplements. Is red meat the answer? Which we see this in infant feeding recommendations all the time. They're often a suggestion to begin red meat early to avoid the risk of iron deficiency, and this is not the answer at all. Red meat is high in total unsaturated fat. It contains a lot of pro-inflammatory compounds, and intake is associated with increased risk of cancer, of heart disease, of diabetes, and of other chronic diseases. And this is what a lot of people don't realize. It would be impossible for a baby to eat enough red meat to meet the RDA. 100 grams or 3.5 ounces of lean roast beef has 1.37 milligrams of iron. So a baby would have to eat 28 ounces of lean beef to meet the RDA of 11 milligrams. So how much iron is in, foods that might be appropriate for infants? Well, to meet that 11 milligram recommendation, the baby would need to eat 6 tablespoons of fortified infant cereal, 13 tablespoons of tofu, 27 tablespoons of lentils. And just so you know, there's 16 tablespoons in a cup, 52 tablespoons of strained infant chicken, or 79 tablespoons of infant strained beef. So it's just interesting to know that. Do infants need iron supplements? Well, breastfed infants do need iron supplements if they're premature. So 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram for the first year is what's generally recommended. Full-term infants, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends a milligram per kilogram beginning from 4 to 6 months of age or until recommended intake is met with solid foods. The Canadian Pediatric Society recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. They believe that you'll get enough iron from that, but you need to ensure sufficient iron in solid foods thereafter. And they don't necessarily recommend an iron supplement unless it's indicated. Formula-fed infants the parents need to choose iron fortified formula. So ensuring sufficient iron in plant-based diets means selecting iron-rich foods from within each food group. And in the legumes group, lentils, chickpeas, and other beans and tofu are great sources. In the grains, the pseudo grains tend to be a little higher in iron, like amaranth and quinoa. Teff is fairly high as well. Wheat, sorghum, fortified grains, nuts and seeds. Seeds are a little more concentrated in iron than most nuts. But in the nut category, cashews, pine nuts, almonds, and Brazil nuts are good choices. In the vegetable category, peas, string beans, and leafy greens are good choices. And in the fruits, prune juice and dried fruits. And other foods that do provide iron are fortified meat analogs and blackstrap molasses. Number 2 is we want to moderate our intake of iron absorption inhibitors. And phytates are one thing that we need to be aware of. And these are most concentrated in bran, especially wheat bran. So you don't want to be sprinkling wheat bran on your food, for example. And we just need to be conscious of the amount of phytates in, the whole grains that are unleavened, especially. We can reduce phytates with leavening and soaking and sprouting and all of these techniques. But if we're using flatbreads, they're a little higher in phytates. And when they're the dietary staple and with little else, we sometimes do see problems there. Polyphenolic compounds from tea. And for both phytates and polyphenolic compounds, if we eat these with meals, we can reduce iron absorption by about 50 to 90% from that meal. So if you're drinking teas that are rich in polyphenolics, like black or green teas, even some of the herbal teas, we want to separate the tea from the meal by at least an hour. Zinc can impair iron absorption as well. Calcium and dairy products interfere with calcium absorption too. We also want to boost intake of the iron absorption enhancers. So the most known one is foods that are rich in vitamin C and organic acids, like citrus fruits and strawberries and all sorts of fruits and vegetables. Allium vegetables like onions and garlic. Beta-carotene rich foods like carrots, and some spices like pepper, turmeric, and ginger can actually enhance iron absorption as well. And then we want to replace meat with legumes rather than dairy. A lot of people, when they're first making the transition to a more plant-based diet, will end up eating more dairy products, lasagna with cheese and macaroni and cheese and pizza with cheese and so forth. We don't want to be doing that because dairy is low in iron, meat is high in iron. So you're swapping a high iron food for a low iron food, and dairy actually inhibits the absorption of iron. So it's a double whammy. So we don't want to do that. We want to choose legumes. Legumes provide iron in a form that is absorbed as we need it without being a pro-oxidant. And we can even cook in cast iron to further boost iron content. Moving on to zinc. Zinc is a nutrient that's necessary for immune function, wound healing, growth and reproduction, and the activity of hundreds of enzymes. It's important for cell signaling and cell division, building proteins and DNA. Recommended intakes, you can see only 3 milligrams for toddlers, 5 for older children, 8 for 9 to 13-year-olds, 9 for teens, females, 11 for males 14 years of age and over, 11 for pregnancy, 12 for lactation. And sorry, that 8 was for 9 to 13-year-olds plus adult women, 19 years of age and older. And needs can be up to 50% higher in those eating high fiber, high phytate plant-based diets. There are homeostatic mechanisms that appear to help people adjust to lower intakes over time, which means that it helps people to absorb more. So this can certainly can occur. Now, if we look at actual zinc intakes, it's not quite the same as iron. What we see is non-vegetarians tend to have the highest at around 11 or 12 milligrams. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians around 10 to 12. And vegans, generally around 11, although Epic Oxford was a little lower. What about in toddlers and youth? Well, it was interesting. They were all pretty close. Omnivores at about 5 milligrams per day, lacto-ovo-vegetarians just below 5, and vegans at about 5 milligrams per day. They were all fairly low, to be honest. So zinc deficiency, what we see with moderate zinc deficiency is impaired immune function, loss of appetite, hair loss, diarrhea, and with more severe deficiencies, stunted growth in children, delayed sexual maturation, impotence, hypogonadism, eye and skin lesions. So it's fairly serious stuff. We need to pay attention to zinc, especially during the growing years. Factors that increase risk are inadequate intakes and poor zinc absorption. And we see inadequate intakes in poor quality diets. So again, highly processed or junk food diets that don't have a lot of variety. We see it in kids that are picky eaters. We see it with late introduction to solid foods, and we see it in adults and teens who are consuming excess alcohol. We see it with insufficient calories, restrictive diets, poverty, eating disorders, and illnesses as well. And then in terms of poor zinc absorption, a high phytate diet, an emphasis on high phytate foods like wheat bran and unleavened breads, a failure to employ techniques that reduce phytates like soaking, sprouting, fermenting, leavening, and of course, we see it with reduced absorption ability. People that have gastrointestinal diseases or malabsorption syndromes, liver disease, renal disease, diabetes, cancer can have a reduced absorption ability. So how do we boost zinc? Well, we want to include zinc-rich foods at each meal. We want to limit the use of very high phytate foods like wheat bran, use food preparation techniques that reduce phytates, and ensure sufficient calories, including regular nutritious snacks for small children especially. So what foods contain zinc? Well, foods that contain at least 2 milligrams per serving are in red. Things like adzuki beans and tofu, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, oatmeal, and you can see that compared to the amount in beef at 3.5. And then foods that are in purple, like the cashews and the wheat sprouts and kamut, are somewhere between 1.5 and 2. And then we get some zinc from other legumes, other nuts and seeds, a little bit from fruits and vegetables as well, but not so much. Avocados being a little bit of an exception at 1.3 for a medium-sized avocado. Zinc supplements, are they needed? Well, too much zinc can impair copper and iron status, reduce immune function, cause nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, and headaches. And the upper limit for zinc for adults is like 45 milligrams, so it's not very high. Single nutrient supplements are just not advised unless they're medically indicated, which means you've got, a zinc deficiency that's been identified. Most multivitamin mineral supplements can provide safe levels of zinc and can provide a boost for those with low intakes, and actually can be of value for children. Moving on to calcium, the big question we often get asked where calcium is concerned is, isn't cow's milk necessary? And the answer is no, it's not necessary. Every mammal produces a milk that's designed specifically for their offspring. No species requires the milk of another species for their survival. In fact, in my opinion, it would defy rationality to assume that any animal would require the milk of another animal for its survival. It just doesn't make sense. If we look at pre-agricultural populations, humans average 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium per day without a single drop of cow's milk. Where did they get it? They got it mainly from plants. Calcium-rich plant foods offer impressive advantages over dairy. It's low in saturated fat, cholesterol-free. They're rich sources of fiber and antioxidants and phytochemicals and vitamin C, K, and folate, magnesium, potassium, boron. And so, plant foods can be a really wonderful sources of calcium if you're choosing correctly. So how much do we need? Well, the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, is actually quite high in North America. It's a little lower in a lot of the European countries, but it's 700 milligrams a day for 1 to 3 year olds, 1,000 for 4 to 8 year olds, and 1,300 for 9 to 18 year olds. It's 1,000 for adults, for females 9 to 50, and for males 19 to 50, and for males 19 to 70. And it's 1,200 for women over 50 and men over 70. So how much are people actually consuming? Well, looking at, these 6 studies that provided calcium, average calcium intakes, we're looking at close to 900 milligrams a day in Western countries for vegans, over 1,000 or 1,068 for lacto-vegetarians, and about the same for omnivores. So vegans definitely having slightly lower intakes, but intakes that are actually higher than a lot of people might imagine them to be. Intakes in toddlers and youth in the veggie were actually pretty dismal. Omnivores just over the 400, lacto-ovo around the 400, vegans closer to 300. This is definitely lower than what most experts would recommend. So how do vegans and vegetarian people do in terms of their bone health? Well, the EPIC Oxford study was a little concerning. There have been a lot of studies that have reported somewhat reduced bone density and increased fracture rates among vegans compared to omnivores. But the 2020 study, the EPIC Oxford study, looked at about 55,000 individuals, and they found that the risk for total fractures was almost 1.5 times increased, and in vegans compared to omnivores. And this means about 20 more hip fractures for every 1,000 people over 10 years for vegans. The higher risk, however, was only observed in vegans with a BMI under 22.5. So vegans who had more, sort of muscle mass and body weight had lower risk, or no greater risk than omnivores. The increased risk was actually mainly for postmenopausal women. It wasn't so much for men. So why did we see increased risk? Well, vegans have lower body mass index. So the vegans are thinner. They have a BMI averaging 22.1 compared to 24.5 for the omnivores. They had in this study, they had lower calcium intakes, 591 milligrams versus over 1,000 for the omnivores. They didn't look at vitamin D, but other Epic Oxford studies show significantly lower intakes of vitamin D. They had lower protein intakes, about 13.3% of calories versus 17 for the omnivores. And they used a lot less hormone replacement therapy, which actually can increase bone density. So there are a number of reasons why they may have had higher risk. But I can tell you from personal experience, this is, I'm 64 years old. I have a family history of osteoporosis. I had my bone density done after 20 years vegan. So I was about 50 years of age when I had it done. And I haven't had it done since, but I should get it done again. But my lumbar spine bone mineral density was 2.5 standard deviations above the young adult mean. My bone mineral density of my right femur was 2 standard deviations above the young adult mean. And just so you know, osteopenia is 1 to 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean, and osteoporosis is greater than 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean. When I went in to get my results from my doctor, his jaw, he opened my file and his jaw dropped. He said, your bone density is so high that we had to put an arrow at the top of the chart because we couldn't plot it. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but just keep doing it. He had ordered my bone mineral density because he was concerned because I had been vegan for many years. And I was a slim white female with a family history of osteoporosis. So, and I can tell you, I'm quite sure why I have strong bones. It's because I eat a very good diet. I make sure I get enough calcium and vitamin D and other nutrients that go towards building strong bones. But I'm physically active, and that's the key. When you're physically active, you're telling your body to stay, your bones to stay strong. So, and yes, that's me doing the handstand there. Strong vegan bones are really about meeting the RDAs for calcium, ensuring reliable sources of vitamin D, which help with calcium absorption, including some calcium, vitamin D fortified foods if we can't get there, eating a lot of vegetables and fruits, at least 9 servings a day, designing the diet to ensure optimal intakes of other bone building nutrients, like potassium and magnesium and vitamin K and all of those things. And we want to get weight-bearing exercise. And I aim for at least 60 minutes, 6 or 7 times a week, actually 7 times a week generally. So that's, what we should be doing when we live in a fairly sedentary society. I sit at a desk a lot of the time. I need to fit exercise in. It's just so important. So how do we get enough calcium without dairy? Well, we want to eat sufficient calcium-rich plant foods like low oxalate greens, tofu made with calcium, chia seeds, almonds, figs, beans like black beans and great northern beans. And we can use a little bit of tahini, blackstrap molasses, things like that. The big question, I can remember back in the 90s when the dairy industry in Canada claimed that they had an ad in magazines that said, sure, you can get calcium from plant foods, but it's not bioavailable. And that, of course, is not true. We absorb from dairy products about 34%, some, 32 to 34% of the calcium that's in that food. We absorb about the same amount of calcium from tofu made with calcium and from soy milk, possibly a little bit less from soy milk in the 25 to 32% range. We absorb a little bit less from most legumes, just over the 20%, and sweet potatoes. But we absorb actually significantly more from low oxalate greens, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 70% from broccoli and kale and Chinese greens and turnip greens and mustard greens. These foods are also our sources of vitamin K and potassium, all sorts of nutrients that move us towards building stronger bones. So they're an exceptional source of calcium. However, we don't get as much calcium from greens that are high in oxalate, even though looking in a chart of calcium content of food, they look like they're really high up. But because they're so high in oxalates, the oxalates bind to calcium, making it unavailable for absorption. We only get about 5% of the calcium from spinach, beet greens, and Swiss chard, and from rhubarb as well. The other thing, number 2, that we can do is to select calcium-fortified non-dairy milks and other foods with added calcium if we have a hard time getting to where we need to be. Calcium-fortified milks provide about 300 to 450 milligrams of calcium per cup. Tofu made with calcium provides about 100 to 300 milligrams per half cup. You just need to read the label. 1 to 2 servings of non-dairy milk, along with other calcium-rich plant food choices, will typically get us easily to the RDA, whether you're an adult or a child. We want to be aware of factors that inhibit calcium absorption. The things that have a negative impact are excessive oxalates or phytates, excessive sodium, a high acid load, alcohol, and caffeine. Positive impact, of course, vitamin D and fruits and vegetables as well. Other factors affecting calcium absorption are the amount of calcium consumed. So absorption efficiency decreases as calcium consumption at a meal increases. So if you eat your entire 1,000 milligrams of calcium at one meal, you'll absorb far less than if you distribute that 1,000 milligrams over 3 meals, for example. Age and life stage matter too. Calcium absorption is as high as 60% in infants and young children. Absorption decreases to 15 to 20% during adulthood, except during pregnancy when it goes up again. Looking very briefly at vitamin D, meeting the RDA is an issue for everyone, but many studies suggest the risk is higher among vegans because we have fewer dietary sources. Most people don't make enough vitamin D from sunshine exposure. And people that live in the north, like I do, I live in Canada, we don't make vitamin D from sunshine between about October to March or April. So it's a long time to go without making vitamin D from sun. And our ability to produce vitamin D from sunshine depends on the latitude that we're at, the time of year, the time of day, the cloud cover, our age, our body weight, our skin color, our skin exposure. All of those things can make a big difference. The RDA for vitamin D is 400 IUs for infants 0 to 12 months and 600 for everyone else from 1 to 70 years of age, and 800 for those over 70 years of age. So food sources for everyone, food sources are mushrooms that are grown in UV light, eggs, fish, liver, fortified foods like non-dairy and dairy milks, and cereals. So you can see for people that are eating whole food, plant-based diets, they're not eating many, if any, fortified foods. There's not a lot of sources. They need to rely on sunlight. If they don't get enough sunlight, then they need a supplement. So supplements, 400 IUs is recommended for all infants to age 2. 600 is often suggested for children. 1,000 to 2,000 is often suggested for adults with higher intakes, possibly needed for seniors. Vitamin D3 raises serum levels to a little bit greater extent than D2 and maintains higher levels longer than D2. Plant-based D3, however, from lichen is widely available, so it's not an issue. Moving on to vitamin B12. Vitamin B12, the RDA, is close to 1 microgram for young children. It's close to 2 for older children, and for everyone 14 years of age and older, it's actually 2.4, and it's getting closer to 3 micrograms during pregnancy and lactation, 2.6 and 2.8. Plant foods actually come up short on B12. So B12 is an issue for plant eaters. Plant foods are just not reliable sources unless they're fortified. even foods that are commonly thought to be reliable sources, like organic vegetables, seaweed, fermented foods, and mushrooms, should not at this point be relied on as sole sources of vitamin B12. And just, to give you, a little bit of the reason why, seaweed, for example, the B12 in seaweed, when the seaweed is dried, is often the active B12 is converted to inactive forms of B12. So it's not as usable in that respect. Fermented foods, well, it depends on how dirty the containers are, how much bacteria are in the containers when the foods are being fermented. Mushrooms, again, are they grown on human manure, or what are they grown on? That will make a difference for their B12 content. And so at this point, these just are not consistent, reliable sources. Vitamin B12 stores may last 2 to 3 years or more in adults. However, breastfed babies born to B12 deficient mothers can develop B12 deficiency within months or even weeks of birth, in some cases causing irreversible brain damage. This is something that just simply should never happen. Pregnant and lactating women need to make sure they have a reliable source, and we need to make sure we have reliable sources throughout life. Deficiency symptoms include megaloblastic anemia, which is all of the symptoms like weakness and fatigue and all of that. It can cause eventually nerve and brain damage, gastrointestinal disturbances, and elevated homocysteine, which can increase risk of cardiovascular disease. There is a higher risk for seniors. In developed countries, 6% of people 60 plus are B12 deficient. And this is, very significant. This isn't just vegans or vegetarians, this is everyone. B12 deficiency increases the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. 10 to 30% of individuals over 30 have a diminished ability to cleave the B12 off the protein it's bound to in animal products due to lower gastric acid and reduced enzyme production. The Institute of Medicine actually recommends that everyone who's over 50 relies on supplements or fortified foods for their B12 and not on animal products in their later years, 50 plus years. We don't want to mess with B12. Vegans, vegetarians, and everyone 50 plus needs to ensure reliable sources daily to monitor B12 status. So what are reliable sources? Well, certainly supplements are reliable sources. B12 fortified foods like non-dairy milks, and animal products for those under 50 who are eating animal products, who are eating a sort of a predominantly plant-based diet. So how much should we be getting from supplements? Well, you can see the RDA here at a couple micrograms a day. The recommended doses are 5 to 10 micrograms for toddlers, about 25 micrograms. This is a daily dose for 4 to 8-year-olds, and then possibly 25 to 50 for 9 to 13-year-olds, and around the 50 for adults, possibly 100 micrograms. For those 65 plus, many people are recommending 500 to 1,000 micrograms a day. During pregnancy and lactation, 50 to 100 micrograms is adequate as well. If we're just dosing 2 or 3 times a week, we're looking at about 1,000 micrograms a day. This is not recommended for seniors. Actually, it's recommended that they do daily B12. So what form is best? Cyano versus methyl and adenosylcobalamin. And this is the great debate among many practitioners in the sort of plant-based world, with some of our very respected voices saying we need to rely on cyano, and others saying it should be methyl. And cyano is the synthetic form of B12. It contains a molecule of cyanide. However, the amounts are less than what would be consumed in common foods like flax, fresh apple juice, apricots, those kinds of things. This is the most stable and least expensive form. So if we're looking at providing it, in foods or to the global population, that's not as well off, cyanocobalamin makes a lot of sense. It's safe for most people, but there's a caution for people with inherited disorders of B12 metabolism, smokers, and those with kidney disease. For those people, it's probably better to rely on methyl and adenosine. These are the natural forms of B12. They are a little bit less stable, but they're better retained once they're absorbed. Some experts suggest, because they're less stable, that we aim for 1,000 micrograms a day. And some experts suggest taking both methyl and adenosine for best results. And so I think that makes sense, because they have, can be used slightly differently in the body. And that sort of would help to cover all your bases. I think you can do either. I'm, lean towards the natural forms myself, generally, but I think that either can be quite suitable. Omega-3 fatty acids, is fish necessary in the diet? And the answer is no. Omega-3 fatty acids are present in plenty of other foods. They're present in land plants like chia, flax, and hemp seeds and walnuts, and the ahi flour and the achium seed oils, which aren't very common foods, so not going to be relied on. They're also present in greens, although greens are very low in fat, so you'd have to eat a lot to get enough. They're also present in sea plants, microalgae in the form of supplements, and macroalgae, which only provides EPA. They're present in eggs, which is only DHA, not EPA. So do vegetarians and vegans get enough omega-3s? Well, our intakes of ALA are generally similar to or higher than omnivores. Of EPA and DHA, we generally have negligible intakes in vegans unless we take microalgae supplements. It's low in vegetarians, with eggs providing, moderate amounts. What about our status? Well, plasma levels of ALA are similar to that of omnivores. DHA and EPA, about 30% lower in lacto-ovo and about 40 to 70% lower in vegans. So what about conversion of ALA to EPA? Because technically ALA can be converted to EPA and DHA, but since vegans essentially consume no EPA or DHA from the diet, they rely on endogenous conversion unless they're taking the supplements. In most humans, conversion is fairly inefficient, averaging about 5 to 8%. It is higher in young women. There was a study showing conversion to EPA and to DPA and DHA being about 30% in young women, because their bodies are prepared for pregnancy, of course. And but for men, it was a lot lower than that. So I have 4 tips for optimizing omega-3 fatty acid status. Number 1, be aware of factors that depress conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA. And the non-diet factors are genetics. We can genetically have less capacity to convert. Gender, men tend to be less efficient than women. Age, infants, especially preterm infants, have less capacity to convert, and seniors have less capacity. Smoking and chronic diseases like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and hypertension can impair conversion as well. And then we have a number of diet factors. The first being high intakes of omega-6 fatty acids. So if we're eating a lot of omega-6 relative to omega-3, this can depress conversion up to probably 40 to 60%. And this, we'll talk about the solution to that, but it's pretty simple. Inadequate nutrition, insufficient protein, lack of vitamin and mineral cofactors like zinc, magnesium, niacin, pyridoxine, vitamin C, trans fatty acids, and alcohol, and very high fat diets actually can depress conversion as well. Number 2 is to ensure sufficient alpha-linolenic acid. And for, if you look at the recommended intakes, they, range from 0.7 for toddlers to, 1.6 for adult males and 0.7 in females to 1.1 in adults. What I recommend is for people who are consuming no EPA and DHA, that we double those intakes to 1.4 to 3.2 grams per day. So 1.4 during the toddler years and 3.2 for adults and for teens. And for women, it would be 2.2 grams during adulthood per day, and a little higher during pregnancy and lactation. Plant sources of omega-3, well, we get about 2.6 grams in an ounce of walnuts. We get about 1 in a tablespoon of chia seeds, 1 in a tablespoon of ground flax seeds. 2.5 in a tablespoon of chia seeds, 1.6 in a tablespoon of ground flax, 1 in a tablespoon of hemp seeds, and less than 0.1 in a cup of greens. So if we're aiming for 2.2 to 3.2, we'd have to eat 20 or 30 cups of greens at least to get enough. We'd need to eat 2 or 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds, and just over a tablespoon of ground flax, or a tablespoon of chia seeds, or an ounce of walnuts. We want to moderate our intake of omega-6s if they're excessive. So increasing omega-3 fatty acids is the most important way to balance essential fatty acids. So we want to focus more on increasing the omega-3s than decreasing omega-6s. But in some cases, it can be helpful to moderate omega-6 intake, especially when intakes are very high. And we can do that just by, if we're using oils in cooking, for example, not choosing omega-6 rich oils like safflower and grapeseed and sunflower and corn and soy and cottonseed and sesame oil. Instead, we would choose, an avocado or an olive oil, for example. Or we might use an omega-3 rich oil for salad like flax or hemp. And we might, just moderate our intake slightly of omega-6 rich whole foods, but that's something that you would definitely worry a lot less about, like pumpkin and sunflower and sesame seeds. And then you want to consider direct sources of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Who might benefit from supplementation? Well, certainly those with increased needs, like pregnant and breastfeeding women, those who may not convert efficiently, like people with diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, people that have traditionally consumed a lot of fish, possibly seniors, possibly everyone. We don't know. And that's the reality, is we're not sure if everyone would benefit from it, or if by providing it for children, they would convert less. I generally recommend that. I think at this stage, based on what we know, it's a good idea to supplement with EPA and DHA. Probably, 200 or 300 milligrams per day for adults, a little less for children. So, and typical suggested intakes, as I mentioned, 70 to 120 milligrams for children, 200 to 300 for adults, 300 to 500 for pregnant and lactating women. People with a diagnosed deficiency may need more, like 800 to 1,000 milligrams per day. And finally, iodine. Iodine is a nutrient that we need to have on our radar. Severe iodine deficiency results in cognitive impairment, and it is the #1 cause of preventable brain damage in the world. Mild deficiency in pregnant women and infants can lower IQ in their offspring by 10 to 15 points, adversely affecting their learning ability. So how do vegans and vegetarians do? Well, vegans are at increased risk of poor iodine status, generally based on the studies we have. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians are at lower risk than vegans because iodine is present in dairy products. And it's not present because there's some magic about it. We use iodine to disinfect the teats of cows, so the iodine gets into the milk that way. And those living in countries with a high prevalence of deficiency are especially vulnerable because the iodine in soil varies pretty dramatically in different nations. And so some countries, there's some places in Europe, for example, that there's just not much iodine in the soil. So people have a higher risk of deficiency. And, if you look at the RDA, it's 150 micrograms for adults, and it's a little higher, 220 in pregnancy, 290 in lactation. It's 90 to 120 during childhood, but it's 110 to 130 for infants, which is really high. And it means it needs to be coming from breast milk. So breastfeeding moms need to make sure they have a source. The upper limit is not that high. So for a 1 to 3-year-old, their RDA is 90, their upper limit is 200. For a 4 to 8-year-old, it's 300. For 9 to 13, it's 600. For an adult, it's 1,100 micrograms of iodine. So it's you know, it's not a big window between the RDA and the upper limit, especially for young children. So food sources: iodized salt, sea vegetables, fish and seafood, milk, eggs, and plants grown in iodine-rich soil. Bread, it's in the dough conditioners. So how do we get 150 micrograms? Half a teaspoon of iodized salt, 1/16 of a teaspoon of kelp powder, 2 sheets of nori, the big sheets of nori, a half a teaspoon of dulse granules, 1.5 cups of milk, 6 large eggs, 6 ounces of fish, just to give you an idea of the relative amounts that you would require of these foods. So certainly for those that are trying to minimize salt intake, the seaweed can be a source. The problem is that it's quite variable among various seafoods. And the other thing is it's so highly concentrated, we have to be careful to not exceed the upper limit. So if you get 150 from a 1/16 of a teaspoon of kelp, 1/8 of a teaspoon exceeds the upper limit for a small child. So we just need to be very conscious of that. We need to recognize that. Oh, and it's 6 slices of bread. So how do we boost intakes? If we're using salt, we can select an iodized salt or iodized sea salt, include appropriate amounts of seaweed, use a supplement or multivitamin or iodine drops if we're so inclined. So the last part of my presentation, which I can zip through pretty quickly, is what to eat. So this is not a diet of deprivation by any stretch of the imagination. This is beautiful, colorful foods. And one of the places that we can start is by looking at a food guide and looking at the amounts of foods within each food group that would be appropriate to be consuming. And this is the vegan plate from Becoming Vegan in the Plant Powered Protein books. This is the plant-based plate from Nourish. And this is Canada's food guide, which if you're not aware of Canada's food guide, dairy products in Canada's food guide no longer have a designated group. They haven't been excluded from the food guide, but they are just included as one among many choices in the protein group. As you can see, half the plate is fruits and vegetables, 1/4 of the plate is whole grain foods or grain foods, but they say choose whole grain. And then protein foods, which includes meat and poultry and tofu and nuts and seeds and legumes and so forth. But what's really interesting is consumers are encouraged to choose plant protein sources every day and to choose them more often than animal-based protein foods, which is really quite amazing. We want to eat most. You need to remember that every single cell of your body is a product of what goes into your mouth. So we need to be carefully choosing whole foods as opposed to refined foods in our diets. We want to make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. Choosing 9 or more servings of vegetables and fruits a day, and a half a cup raw or a half a cup of raw cooked or a cup of raw leafy vegetables is considered 1 serving. I know I consume probably 12 to 14 servings a day, and I'm sure many of you do as well. You want to go for color and variety. You want every color of the rainbow to be represented. And I'm really funny about this. When I'm making a salad, I want to get every color. I want the purple, blue, the green, the yellow, the orange, the red, and some variations. If I can find a watermelon radish with that bright pink color, it's just the greater the variety and color, the more phytochemicals that you're consuming and antioxidants and all of those powerful foods. You want 3 servings of legumes a day. And it doesn't mean it's 3, bowls of beans. It could be scrambled tofu. It could be a cup of soy milk. It could be some peanut butter on bread. It could be some hummus. But you want to be including some of these foods at pretty much every meal. And having at least 1 serving as whole legumes every day, either beans or lentils, is really key. You want to select whole grains, mostly intact, and vary your intake of grains with your energy needs. So people that are trying to lose weight may go very low on their intake of grains, and they may focus more on vegetables and fruits and legumes as their staples and consume very little of these foods. People who are athletes may need 10 or 12 servings a day to meet their caloric requirements. So it really varies with individuals. And it's really important to get rid of the refined grains, but we also need to recognize that all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar isn't the same as a bowl of oatmeal. A box of flaked cereal like wheat flakes does not equal a wheat berry salad, for example. There is a hierarchy of whole grains, and that hierarchy begins with intact whole grains. In intact whole grains, we're talking about, grains pretty much as they're picked off the plant. You just remove the outer husk, like barley and oat groats and quinoa and kamut berries and these kinds of things. These are foods with, nothing's been added, nothing's been taken away, everything's there. And as you go down the list, then you cut those grains, and then you roll the grains, and then you may shred the grains, and then grind the grains. And as you go down the list further, you flake the grains, and then you puff the grains. And as you go down this whole grain hierarchy, they're all made with whole grains. But as you go down the hierarchy, you're increasing the surface area of the food. You're increasing the rate at which it will be absorbed into the bloodstream. You're increasing destruction of nutrients and valuable components like phytochemicals. So as you stick closer to the top of the hierarchy, the best you could do would be sprouting these whole grains, because then you're actually enhancing its nutrition profile instead of degrading the nutrition profile. So many people think if they buy something with whole grain on the box or the bag, that's all they need to worry about. And that's not. We want to be eating these foods as close to as grown as possible. On nuts and seeds, we want at least a serving a day. And your intake would depend on your energy needs and whether or not you're on a limited diet because you're trying to reverse disease, for example. But at least a serving a day, because this is your source of omega-3s. You want to, when it comes to nuts and seeds, go for variety in omega-3s. So omega-3s, again, you're talking chia, flax, hemp seeds, walnuts. But what a lot of people don't realize is different nuts and seeds feature different nutrients. Like the richest sources of vitamin E are almonds and sunflower seeds. The richest sources of calcium in the nut and seed world are almonds, chia seeds, poppy seeds, and sesame seeds. The best sources of iron and zinc are cashews and seeds. Potassium, almonds, pistachios, and pumpkin seeds. Magnesium, Brazil nuts, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, sesame seeds. Manganese, hazelnuts and pecans. Selenium, Brazil nuts. And so you get my point. You just want to include variety for that reason. And you want to sprinkle generous amounts of herbs and spices over your foods. These are the foods that have perhaps the most, the greatest amounts of phytochemicals and antioxidants per gram. And they can be quite powerful, like turmeric, for example, is a powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory compound. And so just including a variety in your meals is a really good idea. And one of the things that we can do is to use more ethnic foods. In Asia, for example, they use a lot of turmeric, and they use a lot of things like garam masala, which is a mix of seasonings, cumin, like black cumin and other cumins that are really powerful promoters of health. And you can even add, cinnamon and nutmeg and cloves and things like that to your breakfast bowls. And you can, use ginger and garlic and these kinds of foods with a more of an Asian flair. And so just including a wide variety is the key. We want to absolutely minimize highly processed foods, even if they have a label of vegan or vegetarian or whatever. Processed foods are processed foods, and we want to minimize their intake. These are foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, generally not the healthiest choices. So we just want to get rid of them. We want to choose organic when we can. And growing foods in your own garden is really wonderful. But purchasing organic foods is a really good choice. And then we need to ensure reliable sources of all essential nutrients. Some nutrients can fall short, and we want to make sure we get reliable sources of B12, vitamin D, iodine, and omega-3s. And if we need supplements, especially B12, we need to take them. And I think one of the last points I want to make is parents, we need to teach our children. And it is, our eating patterns are established in childhood, and they profoundly impact food choices during adulthood. And providing children with nutritious whole plant foods is a gift that really and truly lasts a lifetime. I put a lot of emphasis on fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and lentils and all of those foods when my kids were little, and they still love those foods, and they're really important parts of their diet. But I want to finish with a bit of a story, because I have lots of stories about my kids shocking people with what they would eat. But I can remember my daughter when she was 9 years old walking up the stairs from getting ready for bed. And she said, "Mom, can I have a bedtime snack?" And I said, "Sure, honey." And she said, "Well, what can I have?" I said, "Well, take a look in the fridge and see what you find." She found a bunch of fresh spinach. And she said, "Oh, Mom, we have spinach. Can I cook the spinach?" And I said, "Sure." And she cooked the spinach, and with fresh garlic, she got out the garlic, chopped the garlic, put it in, and it was sitting on her plate. And she, chopped up a lemon, and as my 6-year-old son's walking up the stairs, she's squeezing the lemon on her spinach. And he looks at her and he says, "Huh, is that spinach?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, well, "Is there any more?" And she said, "Oh, sorry, I'm eating the last bat." And he burst into tears. And I thought, who would believe a 6-year-old's crying because he can't get any spinach? So I said quickly, "Oh, we have broccoli." He said, "Broccoli, okay." And that was it, but it's often your reaction to a food, how you treat food, what you teach children, how they come along with you to the farmer's market and get to pick the different things, growing the foods, doing all of those things that instills a love for healthy foods. And that is so, so important. In summary, well-designed plant-based diets are the highest quality diets. They are nutritionally adequate at every stage of the life cycle. And these are some of my books, which you may be familiar with. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. And I'll stop my share and take questions.
All right. So thank you so much, Brenda, for that very comprehensive presentation. That was great.
You're very welcome.
So we're going to go ahead and begin our live Q&A session. And actually, just before we do that, so you showed your books, but where can people get your books?
Well, they're available from, major bookstores. They're available on Amazon from our book publisher, the book publishing company. So yeah, they're pretty widely available.
Okay. And how about people finding you on social media?
Well, you know what I would love if anybody would ever want to help me with becoming good at social media, but probably I'm most active on Facebook. And there's actually a group called The Work of Brenda Davis. And that is a discussion group. And then I have a basic Facebook, Brenda Davis, you'll see me there. I haven't learned to do Instagram, even though I have an Instagram account. I never go there, so I need to learn how to do that.
Okay, great. And just for our viewers, we were just showing on the screen that you can actually get your book through our website as well.
Oh, wonderful.
And if you buy it through our website, I believe it's Amazon that ultimately is the bookseller, but we'll get a small little portion to help support what we do here at the Real Truth.
Wonderful. Oh, that's the best idea of all.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, Brenda. So for the sake of the audience, I just want to go over a couple of things for the Q&A. We don't take questions directly from chat. What we do is we take questions by raising your hand. If you're not familiar with how to do that, the button second from the right is called reactions. You'll click on that and then you'll select raise hand. And then if I call on you, I'll unmute you and ask you to state where you're from and to ask your question. And then we just ask that questions are brief and on topic. And I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you as well. So such as, so from your work with people with diabetes, what foods cause people to have an increase in their blood sugar, and what foods cause them to be able to decrease their blood sugar?
A lot of people ask this question and think that it's really specific foods. It is overeating that causes problems with blood sugar, and overeating, the worst foods to overeat are refined foods and processed meats. Those are the worst foods to overeat, and any animal products can be problematic, but processed foods, refined foods without any fiber, those are the foods to be really concerned about. But overeating that leads to overweight and obesity can cause fatty liver, can cause fat to accumulate even in your pancreas. And that literally drives insulin resistance. Anything that causes inflammation, oxidative stress, dysbiosis, lipotoxicity, all of those things which, are caused from these highly processed crappy diets can induce insulin resistance and problems with your blood sugar.
Thank you. And we hear a lot of talk in the plant-based world about reversing diabetes through a plant-based diet. Can all type 2 diabetes be cured with diet and lifestyle, or are some people unable to lower their blood sugar, unable to reverse their insulin resistance?
Yeah.
And how is it possible to fix any sort of issues with the pancreas, the beta cells producing the insulin in the first place?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. Now, I first of all will say that there are some people with type 2 diabetes that will never be able to completely reverse their disease, but there is virtually no one that cannot improve their prognosis and reduce their requirement for medication and insulin. We can all do that. And so improving the diet, I would say a small percentage of people, and it's mainly people who've had diabetes for a very long time that have done a lot of damage to their pancreas, that we don't always get to see complete reversal. Although I've worked with people who have been diabetic for 20 or more years and had complete reversal. So it is possible. And it depends on how hardcore you go with your diet. So the more sort of whole food, higher raw, little bit, this will come as a bit of a shock, but sometimes, focusing not so much on the whole grains and starchy vegetables, but more on the legumes and non-starchy vegetables, getting sort of a lower caloric intake to reduce that. What you want to do is reverse lipotoxicity. That takes weight loss. And when you reverse lipotoxicity, you reverse insulin resistance. You want to promote a healthy gut microbiome. So you want more fiber in your diet. You want to reduce inflammation. You want to reduce oxidative stress. When you do all of those things, you start to turn things around. And it's not always super fast. It can take time, but it's faster than what most people would imagine it would be, I think. Now, you talked a little bit about how do you sort of get your beta cells functioning if they're not functioning properly. Well, sometimes beta cells, there's some studies that suggest that beta cells just go to sleep when they're when there's so much fat being stored in the pancreas and so on, that they can actually wake up again in some cases. Not all cases, but in some cases, beta cells can reawaken. And we've seen this. So certainly you want to get your diet as clean as it can be. You want to reach a healthy body weight. You want to be physically active. One of the best things we did in the Marshall Islands for our, for our participants was get them moving after every meal. No sitting after you eat. After you eat, you move your body. That allows your body to, just use the energy you've eaten so much more efficiently. And so that's just absolutely critical.
Great. So question, one more question before I open up to the audience. So we just had Pamela Popper on before you, and she was talking about vitamin D and our obsession with getting, our vitamin D levels high in the blood, but there's no real research that shows that doing so has an impact on health, and that it may be that there's a reverse causation with regard to, like, when you see somebody is sick and they've got a low D, it may be because because they're sick that their D went down. Is there any sort of research that you see that goes beyond just showing, getting D high in your blood, but actually shows you endpoints in health and life expectancy with regard to raising D levels?
Well, probably the most comprehensive study that or report that I've ever seen, which is over 50 pages, was from Michael Hollick. And certainly, I think there's evidence to show that having vitamin D in, a specific range, the NIH and their health professionals information fact sheet provides their recommended healthy ranges. And to be honest with you, I've actually seen a lot of individuals who are eating vegan get their levels tested, and they're not within that healthy range. They are dismal. They're so low, it's concerning. And part of the issue is there's just not a lot of natural sources of vitamin D in a plant-based diet. Now, some people live in, Florida or Southern California or Hawaii or whatever, and they may have pretty good access to sunlight year round. I don't. And so I need to have a better, certainly a supplement, especially during the months when I don't get sunshine. But I think that in my view, the evidence is strong enough that I don't know that we have to even measure our levels, to be honest, unless you haven't been doing anything for a long time. I think what people just need to do is make sure there's a source, or take a supplement to make sure they're getting a source of vitamin D. I don't think it's worth risking, to be honest. I think that vitamin D, vegans have a higher incidence of osteoporosis and osteopenia, and vitamin D is protective for that. It's somewhat protective against colon cancer and some other things. So I just think it makes sense to be meeting at least the RDA for vitamin D, and people have a hard time doing that without a supplement in many cases. Not in all cases, but in many cases.
Thank you. All right. So Rita, where are you from? What's your question?
This is Rita Batija from Long Island. Hi, Brenda.
Hi, Rita. A fellow dietitian.
Beautiful job. Beautiful job.
Thank you so much.
Any thoughts on the digestive enzyme to absorb more protein?
On taking digestive enzymes to absorb more protein?
Yes.
Interesting question. I actually don't think it's necessary for most people. I think we produce plenty of digestive enzymes. People, as they get older, may be producing somewhat less. And I think it's an individual thing. So for people that really are struggling, possibly for some seniors, then to me, it may actually make sense to try that route. But I haven't seen good studies looking at people taking these enzymes versus those that don't. So I think generally we don't have good evidence. Have you seen studies, Rita?
Well, I really haven't looked into the studies, but this is as a rule that since the absorption, the lowest was 74% in one of the green group, I thought that taking that would definitely will be helpful.
Yeah, well, it just depends because a lot of times the protein is bound in the food with the fiber, and it just goes right through and out the feces. And so having more digestive enzymes may help if you're lacking, if your production is low. But for most people, they're producing enough, but they're still not going to manage to be able to break down the food well enough. It's like nuts and seeds. They were showing that, the calories in nuts and seeds are overestimated because you lose about 25% in your feces because you just don't chew them well enough to break it down so that you can actually extract those calories. And that happens for all whole foods.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So can somebody be overweight and healthy?
Oh, such a good question. What I would say is I think that when you're overweight, you're producing more cytokines, more inflammatory compounds, especially. So really, it depends on where your fat is stored. So if you're storing a lot of visceral fat in and around your vital organs, that obesity or overweight is far worse than if you're storing it subcutaneously near the surface of your skin. But in my view, carrying excess fat on your body, especially to the level of overweight or obesity, it increases insulin resistance, it increases inflammatory compound production, and it's not ideal. There are huge variations in the health of different overweight individuals. So some overweight individuals who are eating a really healthy diet, they're just eating too much food for their requirements, may actually do very well. They may be physically active. They may be getting all the nutrients they need. They may be eating a ton of antioxidants. They may be fighting that inflammation with all the good things they're bringing in. And they may achieve very reasonable health, even though they're overweight, compared to an individual who's overweight, who's eating a sad diet. There's no comparison. We can't lump people who are overweight all in the same category because that's just not fair. There are many people who are eating whole food, plant-based diet who are carrying excess body fat. And some of them are genetically programmed to store calories. And you could take two individuals who are eating the exact same diet, who are the same height, and you would think they need the same number of calories. One will be, underweight and the other will be overweight because of their genetic differences. And it's not fair. There are some people that are just metabolically efficient. And I have a friend who's, not much different in height. She's about an inch shorter than me. And she needs probably 500 at least calories a day more than I do. She weighs 100 pounds soaking wet. I mean, it's just, it's just not fair. But I'm more metabolically efficient than she is. And so we'll eat our salad, and then I'll have made some little treats or something for dessert. I'll have one and she'll have four, and she'll still be skinnier than I am. And so I think that's something to recognize, that sometimes we think, well, it's our fault, we're just overweight, but we're genetically, human beings are genetically programmed to store calories. And we have differences in that genetic, the one advantage that these people would have, that we who use calories efficiently have, is we'd survive famine way better than they would. But unfortunately, we live in a society of abundance, and there's food everywhere all the time. And so it's not easy to, the average, what 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. So it's more unusual to be normal weight than it is to be overweight, because we live in an obesogenic environment. And so I think it's just important to recognize that And so for someone to achieve a healthy body weight, they have to work pretty hard at it and be physically active and not overeat. And, I have my tricks. So, I make sure I eat my just 3 meals a day. I don't eat snacks, or at least very rarely do. I don't eat after supper. I have a good amount of time, 14-hour kind of fast each night. I make my meals, really relying on vegetables and fruits and with my beans, and then a smaller portion of the more carbohydrate concentrated foods, smaller portions of nuts and seeds. And that's how I maintain my weight. And I'm very physically active. I do, an hour before I did this lecture, I did an hour of spin class. And so, I'm very committed to my fitness. And so that's not that easy for often especially depending on your lifestyle, right? So I hope that answers the question.
Yes. And Brenda, our next speaker is going to be a little bit delayed. Do you mind staying on for a little bit?
Not at all. I'm very happy to do that.
All right, good. So you started talking about what you eat. Can you tell us what you eat for lunch and dinner?
Oh, absolutely. I can even add in breakfast if you like.
throw it in I guess buy 2, get 1 free. All right, take it.
So my breakfast is a bowl, and my breakfast bowl, it consists of whole grains like kamut berries and oat groats and quinoa with some lentils thrown in. And I throw in very small brown lentils so I get that added fiber and protein into that bowl. And then into that, I add I like something creamy. So it'll either be an unsweetened yogurt or it'll be a chia pudding that is just homemade, stuff. And then in that bowl, I have fruit. And so this morning I had a mango, a peach, and some blueberries. Those were my fruits in my bowl. Oh, and a half a banana. So, this is a big bowl. This is not a little bowl. And then on that, I have a seed mix that I store in the freezer. That's chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, all of that stuff, and some chopped up Brazil nuts. And that gets sprinkled on top. And then on top of that, I love something crunchy on top. So on top of that, I have a dehydrated raw granola that I just love. So I do this granola thing, and that goes on top. And then I use a non-dairy milk. And I tend to use soy milk because it's higher in protein and it's, nicely fortified. I sometimes make a homemade almond hemp seed milk, so I'll do that as well. Then lunch is almost always like 99% of the time is a giant salad. So it's a huge, huge plate or bowl of salad with every color of the rainbow. And then I always include a source of protein. So it will either be little cubes of baked tofu, or it'll be beans, or both. Sometimes I make a mix of some sort of whole grain and lentil or something like that that'll go on top. And then, so there's, the protein, and then there's some sort of carbohydrate. So it'll be quinoa or steamed sweet potatoes or something. So it's a really complete meal. And then I often put a little bit of fruit because I like to have, apple pieces or berries or mangoes or something like that on it. And then I put some seeds. So dehydrated sunflower or pumpkin seeds. And then my dressing is usually a hemp seed dressing with tahini and hemp seeds. And then that goes on top. Maybe a little balsamic vinegar on top of that. And that's my lunch. I always have an orange after lunch. That's my little dessert, if you will, because it helps with the absorption of everything. And so and then dinner, well, it just depends what season it is, but it will often be something like one of my favorite dinners is a bowl. Again, start with a grain or sweet potato, and then steamed vegetables, and then some sort of beans or whatever with some nice spicy peanut sauce or something on top. But other favorite meals are stews and soups with, some sort of salad that'd go with them. I love, these collard wraps, and there's all that kind of stuff as well. And sometimes I do very traditional meals like a lentil nut loaf with potatoes and 2 or 3 vegetables, and I make a mushroom gravy and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how I eat.
If anyone doubts that, you can't eat a plant-based diet and love what you eat, I think you've just disproved that.
I love what I eat.
Yeah, I can tell. So, all right, let me get one more question in. I think we actually may be ready. So let me get one more question in. I'm going to confirm that in the background. So I'm just going to go to Laura. Where are you from, and what is your question?
Hang on. Am I off? Am I muted?
No, you're good. You can speak. We hear you.
Okay. I'm from California, and I actually have 2 questions. One is, how absorbable is the calcium from almonds? And then also, is there any tea that wouldn't interfere with calcium absorption, like maybe hibiscus or some other tea that you can drink with the meal?
Yeah, so 2 really, really good questions. The first question to do with calcium in almonds and the absorption. I believe it's about 21%. However, what I do with my almonds is I soak them for a good day. I soak and then I dehydrate them. And that soaking is going to increase the bioavailability of the minerals. So, and I don't think I've ever seen a study that has assessed the bioavailability of the soaked nuts versus the raw unsoaked nuts, but I am positive it would be better. And I absolutely love just eating the soaked nuts. Sometimes I just soak them and put them in the fridge like that. It's almost got a kind of coconutty feel. But soaking and dehydrating is a good way to further improve. So almonds are considered, the calcium is considered sort of moderately bioavailable from almonds, just like sesame seeds, I guess you'd say. Sesame seeds probably even a little lower. And then the second question with regards to tea, I would actually have to look up the amounts of polyphenolic compounds in all the herbal teas. So definitely black tea and green tea are high, and you wouldn't want to include those. But there are a number of herbal teas that would be quite, and actually I could even, but just do a search, low polyphenolic herbal teas, and you'll come up with a number of options, because there's so many herbal teas. Low poly, anyway, but just do that search and you'll come up with some good ones. Let's see, 10. Oh no, what teas are low in polyphenols? There I go. Yeah, they're just showing they're all high. They're just looking at green teas and all of that. But there's an article on polyphenolic content of all of the different teas. So you can definitely find some good articles that way.
Great. Well, Brenda, thank you so much for your time and all the information that you shared with us, and your enthusiasm is very contagious. So
thank you. And can I just answer one other? I just saw something come up in the chat that's important. Some folks are thinking they might need to start taking 1,000 micrograms of B12 a day because of what I said. And I think before you do that, get your B12 levels tested, because some people do fine on 500. I myself am 64, and I eat some fortified foods and I use nutritional yeast. So I only take B12 twice a week. And so if you're using some fortified foods like that, you may not need to take it every day, even as a senior. But if you get your levels tested and know your baseline, that'll be really helpful. My writing partner, Basanto, is 81, and her level she discovered was actually really high. So she actually pulled back a little bit. So it's really a little bit individual.
Right. And if we could unmute the audience, please, so they can all thank you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Davis. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. He's coming back.
That's so nice. Thank you. That's a really nice, fuzzy feeling. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.